André Bazin praised William Wyler with these words, "While Frank Capra, Ford, and Lang occasionally fall into self-parody, Wyler never does." While there exists a John Ford style and a John Ford method, Wyler has only one style. This is evidence that he excludes even self-parody. Other directors would not succeed in imitating Wyler because Wyler's style cannot be defined by any particular form, lighting design, or specific camera angle. The only way to imitate Wyler is to embrace the directorial ethics purely revealed in The Best Years of Our Lives. André Bazin said about Bette Davis in The Little Foxes, in the scene where she ignores her husband who could die if he doesn't take his medicine immediately, we can also see that, paradoxically, the highest level of cinematic art coincides with the lowest level of mise-en-scène.
Didn't think about it much. If I had, I'd have known you'd die before I did. But I couldn't have guessed you'd get heart trouble so early, so bad. I'm lucky, Horace. I've always been lucky. I'll be lucky again.
The other bottle. Please, upstairs, in my room, in the drawer. Daddy! Upstairs, quick! Eddie, quick!
Paradoxically, the lowest level of mise-en-scène corresponds to the highest level of cinematic artistry. This suggests that minimizing any distinctive style enhances a film's artistic quality, and William Wyler fits this description perfectly. However, looking at the scene from The Little Foxes that Bazin praised, there is definitely an artificial style present. Bazin said about this scene, "The absolute immobility of the camera brings dramatic tension to its peak." While the camera doesn't move in this scene, tension is created through changes in light. The husband's movement is treated as a silhouette, causing Bette Davis's face to darken and then brighten. The image of Bette Davis desperately ignoring her dying husband feels chilling. In other words, this scene cannot be said to minimize style as Bazin claimed. In this scene, we see Bette Davis looking back at her husband climbing the stairs to the right. On screen, Bette Davis's gaze is directed to the right, the same direction as her husband. This clearly shows the close relationship between foreground and background action. While the background is not visually clear, it is semantically very sharp. The background suggests a dim but clear catastrophe. These scenes may make us question Bazin's claim about the lowest level of mise-en-scène. This direction is intended to visually clarify the narrative, but clarifying the narrative inevitably involves some form of artificial mise-en-scène aimed at creating distinct and obvious dramatic effects. Applying the principle of charity to Bazin's high praise for Wyler, it seems that Wyler's direction is closer to a narrative ethics that aims to convey dramatic situations and narrative as clearly and directly as possible. What Bazin valued most in Wyler was his ability to achieve narrative ethical transparency and dramatic clarity within formal restraint. Wyler is a craftsman with a style without style, erasing his own presence to guide the audience into the story. This is the highest cinematic ethics that Bazin articulated through Wyler. However, the realism that Bazin consistently advocated is not a transparent explanation of a situation. Bazin praised how cameras preserve the ambiguity and complexity of reality. He found cinema's ability to approach the essence of reality in its capacity to capture the subtleties of reality. The reason Bazin identified Jean Renoir as his ideal was that Renoir captured the complex subtleties and emotions of life through free camera movement and composition. The free camera movements that often appear in Renoir's films lead to some truth beyond meaning, independent of narrative information. Renoir almost intentionally departed from narrative, expressing the subtleties of reality through independent camera movements. In Renoir's films, realism that exists independently without direct correlation to narrative is frequently emphasized. This approach has the advantage of gaining autonomy from narrative but also risks formal protrusion by deviating from the narrative. However, John Ford showed the subtle nuances of reality in a form assimilated with narrative. In John Ford's films, the image of a character naturally emerges within the flow of narrative. It is not perceived as a separate aesthetic device, like Renoir, but integrated with the narrative. This is a common trait among great directors of the classical Hollywood era. What differentiates Ford is that he showed this aspect more through deep staging that emphasized the background. In terms of formal difficulty, John Ford's method can be considered more challenging than Jean Renoir's. Renoir's approach is recognized as an obvious style, making his intentions easily discernible. In contrast, Ford's realism is so natural and subtle that most people cannot even recognize that it exists as an artificial choice or artistic intention. This is impossible without extremely sophisticated directorial technique. In other words, Ford achieved the most difficult type of realism, expressing the subtleties of reality with the form itself hidden. Let's look at a scene from John Ford's How Green Was My Valley.
'Tis good. With honours, then. Our son is a scholar.
What is it, Hugh? I can't make sense with it.
Latin it is.
Latin, is it? Why not good Welsh or even English?
It is the fashion.
Fashion. Frenchies, decimal points, and bathtubs full of holes. My poor Hugh, they've stuffed your head with Latin, then.
Beth, my old beauty, you. A black eye, is it?
Go ahead, shout. Wake up the baby, then. You've wakened him up. There is beautiful. The image of my father he is.
Bloody nonsense. Now then, Hugh, what will it be? To Cardiff to school, then the university? To be a lawyer, is it, or a doctor?
Dr. Hugh Morgan. Well, Uncle Hugh, that will be something special.
Yes, indeed, with a lovely horse and trap and a good black suit and a shirt with starch. Oh, there is good, my little one. Now then, a glass of buttermilk for you with all your knowledge.
Yes, Mother, and some of Brown's shortcake.
Oh, and my shortcake is to be fed to the pigs, is it?
No, only I finished yours yesterday. And today is shortcake day with Bron.
I'm sorry, Hugh. Only currant bread I made today. Nobody to eat it now. Oh, Mother, I'm lonely without him. I put his boots and clothes ready every night. But they're still in the morning. There is lonely I am.
Quill, I will have Bron here to live if she will come.
Not Bron. One mistress in the house. Now, Hugh, what will it be?
I will go down the colliery with you, sir.
Have sense, boy. The colliery is no place for you. Why not try for a respectable job?
Respectable? Are you and his brothers a lot of old jailbirds, then?
Oh, leave it now, Beth. I only want the best for the boy.
If he is as good a man as you and his brothers, I will rest happy.
I'm thinking of the boy's future. It was different in our day. There was good money and fair play for all. But Hugh is a scholar. Why take brains down a coal mine?
Would rather, sir.
All right. Decide for yourself. But blame yourself if you are wrong.
The colliery, sir.
All right, the colliery it is.
Good. Where are you going?
To get drunk.
In this scene, the elderly father-in-law in the foreground evokes the aforementioned subtlety with the greatest prominence. In the background, the daughter-in-law holding a child says she is lonely after losing her husband. The protagonist who and his mother both look at the daughter-in-law, as if completely empathizing with her words. But unlike the other two characters, the father-in-law doesn't look at the daughter-in-law and drops his head, while the daughter-in-law raises her head upward. This conveys emotion beyond mere sympathy for the daughter-in-law's words. The audience cannot feel the clarity from the father-in-law's appearance as they would from Bette Davis in Wyler's work. The fact that the father-in-law doesn't make eye contact with the daughter-in-law's words but keeps his head down, appearing to be thinking about something, reveals a complex emotion that goes beyond the clear range of simple sympathy. The father-in-law seems to be surrounded by complicated feelings such as his own helplessness, family loss, life's pain, or the incomprehensibility of sorrow. The audience finds it difficult to make a clear judgment about the father-in-law's inner world. The father-in-law's attitude is similar to the ambiguous moments that Renoir often used cinematically, uncertain but clearly existing human truth. Therefore, this scene is closer to Renoir's characteristics than Wyler's. The subtle and ambiguous emotion shown by the father-in-law can be judged to be closer to the true cinematic realism that Bazin found in Renoir, rather than Wyler's clear narrative and emotional ethics. The realism that Bazin ultimately pursued was a state where form and reality are not distinguished but completely merged. The ideal realism that Bazin dreamed of was a state where the audience feels the subtlety and ambiguity of reality as it is, without being conscious of aesthetic choices. And John Ford was the closest to this. So why did Bazin value Renoir, Wyler, and Orson Welles more highly than Ford? This is very likely because their forms were much more clearly evident than Ford's, allowing Bazin to easily recognize and explain those forms. The fundamental reason Bazin gave a relatively lower evaluation of Ford is probably that Ford's style was so natural and subtle, fused with reality, that it was difficult to analyze it distinctly aesthetically. Wyler delivered clear narratives through deep composition and static camera placement. Welles conducted aesthetic experiments, compressing and expanding reality with powerful depth and intense contrast of light and shadow. Renoir also practiced a form of realism that clearly revealed the complexity of reality through unique camera movements and spatial composition, making it easily recognizable. In contrast, John Ford showed almost none of these formal strategies, and naturally incorporated the subtleties of reality into story and character in an extremely restrained way. It is at this point that Bazin's methodological limitations can be seen. Bazin emphasized that film should capture the ambiguity and complexity of reality, but when it came to his own analysis, he tended to give higher evaluations to directors with easily identifiable forms. He found it easier to analyze and explain the cinematic strategies of directors whose forms were clearly visible, so he understood them more deeply and valued them more highly. This aspect is further emphasized when looking at The Best Years of Our Lives, which André Bazin analyzed.
Hello, Homer. Hi, Steve. Say, Al Stevenson's back there.
Al?
Yeah.
Hi, Al.
Oh, Homer?
How are you? How's the family?
Fine, thanks. Hello, Homer.
Hey, Butch. Say, let's show Al that new routine.
Why, sure.
Got something to show you, Al. Oh, come on. Boy, where'd you hear this?
Are you all set, kid?
I'm ready when you are.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Didn't you like it, Al? We've been working for weeks.
Sure, Homer, it was swell. I thought you were kidding about those piano lessons.
Fred! Hey, Fred!
Analyzing these scenes. Clear juxtaposition of narrative. The joyful piano playing in the foreground is dramatically contrasted with the miserable situation of Fred having a phone conversation in the background. He appears very small in the background, showing that this scene has a very exaggerated depth of space. This composition conveys the narrative situation to the audience with complete transparency. Camera cuts that eliminate unnecessary ambiguity. Fearing that the audience's gaze would be too concentrated on the foreground, Wyler included an additional cut-in through Frederick's gaze to draw the audience's attention to Fred in the background. This shows that he prioritizes clarity and presentation of information for narrative delivery. Therefore, this direction conflicts with Bazin's statement. We can also see that, paradoxically, the highest level of cinematic art coincides with the lowest level of mise-en-scène. This scene is closer to formal exaggeration rather than minimization of mise-en-scène. John Ford, despite displaying much shallower spatial depth than Wyler, surpasses Wyler in effect and sophistication. The first noticeable difference is in the handling of vanishing points. In How Green Was My Valley, an elaborate one-point perspective is formed in the spatial composition centered on the characters. Particularly, the vertex of the external space beyond the door in the background serves as the vanishing point, naturally drawing the gaze from foreground, middle ground, and background to this point. This creates distinct depth and visual clarity in the frame. In this scene, the main lines of the composition clearly form toward the vanishing point marked outside the frame. The direction of the desk, the lines of the door frame, and the structural lines of the wall and ceiling all point toward the vertex outside the screen. The vanishing point serves as the center that integrates the layered elements of the screen into one view. In contrast, let's look at the vanishing point in The Best Years of Our Lives. In this scene, the vanishing point is at a deep point in the lower right. However, the centripetal force of the vanishing point is weaker compared to John Ford's. This is because the space around the telephone booth where Fred stands is overly deep, which makes the vanishing point feel less effective. It has depth but weak visual convergence. In other words, while Ford's depth design is dense and distinct, Wyler's effect of the vanishing point seems dispersed within an exaggerated space, making it formally less clear. These formal differences also affect the way three-dimensionality is formed. Ford delicately controls the distance and composition between characters to create a three-dimensional structure. In contrast, Wyler extremely contrasts the foreground and background. There is depth, but it relies more on contrast than three-dimensional harmony. What's interesting is the reversal phenomenon in emotional expression methods. In Ford's work, emotional lines between characters are revealed very subtly. Ford is formally distinct and elaborate but emotionally delicate with much white space. Wyler is emotionally certain and clear but formally somewhat dull or dependent on exaggerated spatial composition. This relationship shows the fascinating example that form and emotion in film are not always proportional. Formal clarity does not always connect to emotional directness. Let's do additional analysis on why the direction in the scene from How Green Was My Valley is so excellent. In this scene, the foreground and background are carefully balanced to create both visual contrast and a strong sense of depth. He's placed in a relatively wide, empty space, which gives a strong impression of minimalism and emotional emptiness. This visual white space pulls the audience's attention toward that emptiness, making it feel more meaningful and heavy. In contrast, the background is tightly packed. Two characters are placed very close together within a narrow space, filling the area with emotional and visual density. This tight arrangement in a small area stands in stark contrast to the father-in-law's isolation in the foreground. The inclusion of the mother-in-law in the background expands the visual presence of the background itself. If only the daughter-in-law were there, the contrast wouldn't be as strong. But with both women filling the space, the background becomes visually heavier, enhancing the balance of the entire frame. So, while the foreground emphasizes emotional vacancy, the background feels fully occupied, creating a powerful spatial tension and a layered, three-dimensional mise-en-scène. The diagonal layout of the composition also plays a key role. It creates a natural sense of depth by making distant objects appear smaller and closer objects appear larger. This diagonal perspective draws the viewer's eye through the scene, helping us intuitively grasp the spatial distance between the characters in the foreground and those further back. It's a classic use of perspective that makes the scene feel more alive and realistic. Wyler expresses realism through clarity. His scenes are clear, direct, and emotionally precise. Renoir captures realism through subtlety, letting complexity and ambiguity speak, but Ford, especially in scenes like this one, blends both. He offers the clarity of composition with the subtlety of emotional nuance. When we look at everything André Bazin argued for in cinema, respect for reality, depth, and emotional honesty, John Ford might actually come closest to that ideal.